The popular notion of wildlife in Africa, including Namibia, is of extensive areas set aside for conservation and tourism. The assumption has traditionally been that game belongs in commercial game farms and national parks, well away from human settlements. But now things are changing. In a groundbreaking initiative, game is being captured in areas of abundance, including in national parks themselves, and translocated to communal conservancies. What would have been unthinkable mere decades ago, today makes economic sense as a land use option in arid areas, providing sustainable benefits despite evolving climate changes. Wildlife is no longer seen as a quaint oddity of Africa. It is in fact now the basis of a substantial and growing sector of the Namibian economy, with the potential for value-adding and diversification. In Namibia, game is on the move. In the past, the arid plains and dryland forests of southwestern Africa were home to bountiful wildlife. However, increasing human pressure, commercial farming operations, and the decades of warfare prior to Namibian independence substantially reduced wildlife populations. State reserves were declared to protect pockets of wildlife, and the historical residents were systematically evicted from these reserves. The relationship between rural communities and conservation authorities was characterized by mistrust and resentment. On commercial farmland, there was some game, though to a large degree it was seen as competition for cattle, and so was shot out. And in the northern communal areas, warfare and the fact that the people had no vested interest in game meant that most large game species had become locally threatened or extinct.
I remember when I was still working, in the early years, we have done much patrols, of which we were roaming in the whole region. I remember when I was still in Mudumu, I lastly saw the animals which I've seen today in 1982.
This traditional model of conservation and game management, focusing on isolated refuges for wildlife, remained in place up until Namibian independence in 1990. Behind the scenes, however, forward-looking traditional leaders, community members and conservators alike had been laying the foundations for one of the most significant reformations of the land tenure system in southern Africa, and indeed the world, Namibia's Communal Conservancy Program. In 1996, the Nature Conservation Amendment Act was passed, empowering communities on communal land to establish their own conservancies and derive both consumptive and non-consumptive benefits through the sustainable utilization of wildlife resources. Communities that stand to benefit from wildlife do not see it just as competition for cattle and crops or as a threat. They have a reason to ensure its continued survival. Community-based natural resource management places people at the center of both conservation and utilization. As the advantages of game over other land uses become apparent, conservancies are increasingly choosing this option. They have joined the mainstream of responsible and legitimate wildlife managers and are reclaiming their roles as custodians of what is arguably Namibia's greatest asset, its wildlife, a fact that is recognized by the government in both word and deed. When the community as a whole opposes poaching, it is far less likely to take place. Under the old dispensation, however, conditions encouraged poaching.
Pakarani karanga no pocha,
Robson Kunyanda was for many years a poacher. He was the man to turn to if you wanted some bushmeat, antelope, small mammals, elephant, more or less anything you might desire. When the conservancy was established, however, he turned his life around and became a game god. Game is much more plentiful today, he says, because communities are working together and cooperating with the government and NGOs. Capturing game for relocation is a complex and costly operation, requiring well-trained teams with the right mix of bravery and caution. And filming a giraffe release is also not without its perils. Donor support has allowed the Ministry of Environment and Tourism to outsource much of the capture and translocation, although they manage the specialist capture of rhino. This approach has allowed them to oversee and manage ambitious translocations in respect of species, numbers, and geographic range. The capture process can never be entirely without risk, and some losses are inevitable. Nevertheless, the track record in Namibia is well within internationally accepted standards. Extensive use is made of helicopters to capture game, and flying at low altitude, even below treetop height, requires immense skill. Antelope are driven towards the open end of a funnel formed by walls of material strung between poles and trees. Once the antelope enter the funnel, it is closed behind them, and the team drives them further and further down towards the narrow end and onto a ramp leading into the transport truck.
They have to look at the welfare of the animals to make sure that they don't get too stressed, to make sure the capture doesn't take too long, to make sure that when we load them there are no things they can hurt themselves on, and when they're on the truck, to make sure that we sedate them and keep them as calm as possible.
Okay. Bomas must be constructed to suit the game they are to hold. It is essential that their flimsy walls block the view of the outside. If giraffe can see over the boma walls, they will simply run through them. Recently, the rare black-faced impala, which are endemic to northwestern Namibia and southern Angola, have also been reintroduced to their former range. They had been poached to the brink of extinction during the years prior to independence, and only a few populations remained in Namibia. Some breeding herds were relocated to the Etosha National Park. These populations thrived, and today, together with stocks on freehold land, they are being used to restock their former range. The release of black-faced impala into conservancies demonstrates the extent to which poaching has been curtailed, and the confidence that the ministry has in the capacity of conservancies to manage and protect stocks of animals. Over 250 black-faced impala have been relocated to conservancies, mostly to the south of the veterinary cordon fence, which prevents the spread of foot and mouth disease. This required a 21-day quarantine period to show that they were not infected. In the past, translocations from national parks to communal conservancies would have been inconceivable.
We have sourced a variety of wildlife from private farms, but most important, the ministry has donated wildlife from national parks, and these are surplus game in terms of the carrying capacity and the management of these protected areas. The game translocation program to conservancies is a good management option for national parks because you remove the surplus game and release them into communal conservancies.
All wild animals are potentially dangerous to both humans and themselves and must be treated with care when being translocated. Special measures are needed for some.
There are those that load very simply, and there are those that really become very challenging. And perhaps one of the harder antelope to catch and to load is the gemsbok. It is a very aggressive creature. It has long, sharp horns. Even before we load them, if we can, we will actually put pipes on the horn to ensure that they don't damage each other. Once on the truck, we will sedate them, and we will make sure that the big bulls, the highly aggressive bulls, are kept separate from the females if at all possible. They are strange creatures. When it comes to offloading, the next problem is they are very reluctant to climb off the truck. One of the important factors with the zebra is that when you catch, the helicopter pilot does his very best to catch a group. In other words, a male and his females and the youngsters. If you catch them as a group, you load them as a group, they're tolerant of each other. If you mix the groups at capture, which is very easy to do, you will have tremendous fighting on board the truck.
Once antelope arrive at their release destination, they may be put in a boma for some hours or days so that they can calm down and family groups can reassemble themselves. This is known as a soft release. Some species are likely to start fighting if put into a boma, so the hard release method is used, and they exit the transport truck directly into the release area. Namibia has a long history of game capture, with both the MET and private operators building an extensive body of experience which has contributed to best practice standards for the industry. The MET also supports international teams of rhino capture experts to refine the chemical immobilization of rhino.
When it comes to rhinos, of course, these are highly valuable animals, and we do everything we can to ensure that the capture is as safe and as stress-less as possible. They're big animals, they live in pretty inaccessible places, so when it comes to that, we actually are darting them from the helicopter.
They are darted with a cocktail of 3 drugs, a sedative, a spreading agent, and the anesthetizing drug endorphin. This is about 3,000 times stronger than morphine, so potent that a single drop on the skin of a man is enough to kill him.
One of the pieces of kit which is tremendously advantageous to us now is what we call the Rhino Recovery Vehicle. This is a converted Land Cruiser which has everything we need to ensure the safety of the rhino. It has water on board, it has a generator on board, it allows us to put the horn transmitter in, it allows us to monitor the vital statistics, and everything is at hand. It even has the ability to use ultrasound if we need to check for pregnancy in the rhino.
Once loaded into a crate, the rhino must be closely monitored. To date, 23 black rhino have been released into 7 conservancies. Once in danger of local extinction, their numbers are now increasing.
I'm very happy to have rhinos in our area. To be honest, previously the rhinos was roaming in this area. That's where the name of the conservancy is coming from, Doron Ngabas. And Ngabas means a rhino. And that is our appreciation go to the government of the Republic of Namibia, especially the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, who realized that the management of the conservancy can also take over the custodianship of the rhinos.
With close to 60 conservancies already registered and others in the process of registration, choosing the right conservancy for releasing wildlife is critical.
But also a very important thing is that the communities participate in the monitoring of this wildlife. That's very key to us. We cannot do it alone. It's a community initiative. It's their animals now. We will just there to help, but they must be there, take a lead in this process.
The need for objectivity and transparency in decisions about translocations has led to the development of the Wildlife Introduction Advisor, an innovative computer program for assessing a wide range of inputs and prioritizing release options to conservancies. Cooperation between neighboring conservancies strengthens their management capacity and improves their prospects of being successful custodians for game. 4 conservancies have joined together to form the Mudumu North Complex and 2 to form the Kaudom North Complex. In 2009, herds of young eland, each over 40 strong, were released into these complexes in which extensive areas are zoned exclusively for wildlife. Game releases are often important social events, involving the community, traditional leaders, government representatives, and conservancy committee members. The desire to have game reintroduced to its former range stems not only from an economic motivation, but also from a cultural one. Elders desire that the children, the custodians of the future, also experience the richness and diversity of former times.
I'm very much happy that that release is taking place in the presence of the chief and in presence of the children. I see that the wisdom coming from the chief will guide these children to make sure that this game will be here for generations and generations to come. It's not just a symbolic thing, but we have really to take it very serious, so that these children become the custodian of these animals throughout.
The sentiments expressed by Honorable Nandine Daitwa are echoed by leaders in conservancies across the country.
Will not make our spear sharp.
In the past, we could not get this opportunity for our people also to benefit from our game. Now this is in our hands as the Namibian people at large, that we are also going to benefit from the game in our country, the game in our region.
But our children here in the Caprivi region, now very few, maybe they only saw these animals on the pictures. But for what has happened, I'm sure every child, every born child in Namibia or in the region of Caprivi is going to see them.
You can just happy now.
Post-release monitoring of game is critical. Camera traps are set at water holes and on animal tracks. These are triggered whenever animals pass an infrared beam, and the images are subsequently collected and studied. Some antelope are fitted with radio collars. This allows for them to be tracked by radio telemetry, for which community members are given appropriate training. In areas where there is cell phone coverage, Antelope can be fitted with a device that combines the global positioning system with a simple SMS that is regularly transmitted and relayed to the MAT in Windhoek. Where possible, aerial observations are made some days after the release to establish whether or not the antelope have formed a single herd and where they have moved to. The conservancies are not fenced, and game that is released into them is free to roam at will. Consequently, there is a need for cooperation and the sharing of information. As always, the involvement of the community is essential. Bevan Munali has been working with conservancies since the inception of the program, raising community awareness and involvement in protecting wildlife resources. One way he goes about this is by preparing radio broadcasts.
I'm here to inform people that I've got a colleague of mine who want to tell us about the introduction of eland.
Bevan regularly reports on matters affecting the conservancies, such as game releases, encouraging the conservancy members to provide feedback on the condition and movement of released game.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Conservancy members are prepared to go to great lengths to qualify for game translocations, even cutting roads through dense bush with rudimentary equipment so that post-release monitoring can be conducted. Where necessary, they must also establish reliable water points. Community game guards are appointed to monitor events on the ground and record and pass on critical information on game movements, condition, losses, and recruitment. This is done through the event book system, which is now widely recognized as a highly effective management tool and is being replicated in other Southern African countries. It allows conservancies themselves to monitor resources such as wildlife, livestock, rainfall, and fire. As a result, management plans are couched in accessible rather than scientific language, and the community's sense of ownership is enhanced. Wildlife is now recognized as being a substantial national asset. It is therefore accorded high priority in national development plans and Namibia's long-term development strategy, Vision 2030. And it is playing an increasingly important role in alleviating poverty, particularly in rural areas.
Only then will you know your way. Those here dark times, you gotta stay true to your roots now.
The benefits that rural communities can derive from wildlife are multiple. Tourism is the most significant revenue stream for conservancies. They are also given quotas for hunting, shoot to sell, and own consumption. Trophy hunting ventures in particular generate significant revenue, which motivates communities to ensure that game stocks are protected. And the meat derived from own consumption quotas is an important protein source in areas where food security is a real issue. The economic and environmental benefits of recovering game numbers in communal areas are thus clear. However, the cultural dimension is equally important. Generations for whom wildlife would otherwise have belonged to stories of the former times will now be able to see wildlife roaming free. Increasingly then, game is being seen as a viable land use option, particularly in Namibia's extensive arid areas. It is engendering entrepreneurship in the wildlife industries and contributing to the attainment of the Millennium Development Goals and Namibia's national development plans.
By reintroducing wildlife into these communal conservancies, government is creating a development platform. These animals are being reintroduced into the areas where they've occurred historically and where they have the cultural significance. We regard conservancies as local wildlife management units. These conservancies have game monitoring systems in place. They have well-established community game guard systems. They live with these animals on a daily basis, and therefore they have the responsibility, they have the capacity to manage this wildlife and benefit from the management of this wildlife.
Since Namibia's game translocation program was launched a decade ago, over 7,400 animals have been translocated into 34 conservancies throughout the country. Over 80% of these have been captured in national parks. In a sense, parks have become arks, conserving species through the many decades when stocks were dwindling elsewhere in the country. In a world first, they are now returning species to their former ranges, where they will be utilized but conserved for the benefit of rural communities.
Check the culture, I say. Only then will you know your way. In those here dark times, you gotta stay true to your roots now. Be proud and stand up. Get up. Say you're Namibian. Chokai, Uyakai, Takwano, Monohomonati Fela. Uyakai, Uchakai, Takwano, Monohomonati Fela. Ayo, Papa. Yeah, 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 yeah. Meshiwa, Meshiwa, Kalahare. Meshiwa, Meshiwa, Kamikese. Meshiwa, Meshiwa, Kalahare. Meshiwa, Meshiwa, Kamikese. This land of wide open spaces, so many, many, many faces. This land of wide open spaces, so many beautiful faces.